roots and paths to healing. We're gonna talk a little bit about this very important topic under the perspective of Spiritism. And as always, I like to invite everyone to think of yourselves in the perspective of the topic, because when I put drugs, I mean, our minds tend to go initially to the person who is dying of overdose and that really heavy duty drug addict. That's not me, right? And so we tend to think of a whole bunch of people who we think that the lecture will fit right in, right? But it's always important that we recognize ourselves into the problem, because the dynamics of addiction and escaping are present in our lives, all our lives, in different extents, in different forms, in different levels. But the problem is common to all of us, as we will see. So the purpose is to use the knowledge that Spiritism brings to us to be able to live more consciously and more present and more fully in each moment of our lives. And we're going to start bringing definition by the Spirit Suzana de Angelis in the book Existential Conflicts, which is the primary book that we use together with some books of Andrew Lewis in our study this morning. And in this book, she's going to define happiness for us by saying that happiness is unchained by the harmony experienced by the spirit, the pleasant feeling of a duty that has been fulfilled, moral righteousness, which allows within the brain the production of dopamine and other similar substances. What's really unique about this definition is she defines for us happiness in a very particular and specific way, because when we talk about happiness and think about happiness, so many different things can come to mind. The experience of buying a brand new car, you can call that happiness. The experience of helping a friend who is in need, you can call that happiness. And those are two very different experiences, but we give it the same name. We also call love a whole bunch of things that are very different, right? So it's important to define happiness, and here she brings a definition that happiness at the spiritual emotional level is moral righteousness. In other words, is the moment in which you fulfill God's laws, you do what's right, and you experience peace, and you experience a level of happiness that nothing, absolutely nothing in this world can give you. But the experience of being peace, you know what I mean? Although sometimes doing something that's painful and difficult, but you know deep inside yourself that you have done the right thing, and that experience is what she calls happiness. But what she also brings, and it's interesting for us to notice, is that happiness has an organic, material component. When we are in the physical body, there is a biological component to happiness that happens at the brain. And so when the spirit, because the one who truly feels is not the brain, is the spirit, emotions are generated in the spirit, from within the spirit. So when the spirit is content, right, for whatever reason, then the brain will respond to that. There will be a corresponding feeling at the brain, and the brain is activated in what we call the reward circuitry, and some hormones, some neurons will be triggered to release dopamine and other substances, and we will feel a burst of joy, okay, so physically. And this, she says, has been shown by computer tomography, where they can actually locate areas of happiness and unhappiness in our brain as a result of emotions and physical phenomena produced by dopamine and other substances, confirming the thesis of organic nature. So that's what Joanna tells us. So when we think of the brain, this pretty amazing structure, we we know about all the wonderful things that the brain can do, all the achievements that we witness today in the areas of arts, technology, all the advancements, but we tend to forget that the brain also does some very basic and primary functions. And some of these functions is just keep us alive. So the brain is the one who is controlling our breathing, for instance. The brain is the one that puts us to sleep every night, and where our dreams are actually imprinted. So the brain is responsible for a number of very basic functions, if you will. But among those functions, we also have the experience of pleasure that takes place within the brain, as we have seen. So this experience that we can call joy, happiness, excitement is, again, we have this little circuitry into our brain that's called the reward circuitry. So a neuron is activated, dopamine is released in the synaptic cleft, where there is a passage of information from one neuron to another one. And in that moment that dopamine is released, you feel super good. So you have a great feeling. And this circuitry can be activated by different things. Like I said, when you fulfill a duty, when you have a moment of spiritual growth, which I like to call the real miracles that happen in life when we can overcome a difficult pattern, you will experience that. But also when we have stimulus from outside, the same circuitry can be triggered. So when we use drugs, for instance, we will have an activation of the same circuitry, and we have the illusion of happiness for a moment. So what happens is when we use alcohol, when we lit a cigarette, when we use any type of drug, this circuitry is activated, dopamine is released, and then suddenly all our problems seem to disappear in front of our eyes, and we feel good for a period of time. So if you get home at the end of the day and you're very tense and you had a very difficult day, you tell yourself, okay, I'm going to get my little dose of whiskey, or I'm going to have my glass of wine. And this is basically what we are doing. We are messing up with our brain chemistry and creating a moment where we believe we are a little happier than the rest of our days. So the thing is that we never knew of that when we were like children, but we heard of that, right? We witnessed some of that. My son came back from a party last weekend, and he told me, Mommy, I think that the father of my friend drank a little too much because he was talking so loud, and then suddenly he was saying a whole bunch of bad words, and he was like laughing for no reason. And I think that that's what drunk is. I said, yeah, sounds like it. Sounds like it. So anyway, so what happens is, he has never experienced that, but he hears about it. So one day he's going to want to try it and see what that feels like we all did one day, right? And so then you try it one time, and then you're like, this is interesting. And then you try a second time, and you're going to do that, occasionally when you go to a party, on weekends, maybe on vacations. But then for some reason, you try again. Now it's no longer an occasional and weekend thing. Now it happens at the end of each day. And then for some of us, it starts happening earlier in the day. It's no longer the end of the day. Now it starts at lunchtime. And then sometimes it starts in the morning. And so the pattern continues to develop, and we end up in what we call dependence and or addiction. So the scientist says that it's unclear to them why some people will feel the negative effects of drugs and will learn from those negative effects, and some others will not learn, and they will continue to indulge in something that is inherently damaging to them. So we will have a number of people walking around. You know, we have the people that we like to think are, you know, overdosing and dying, but we also have a number of people in our society today for whom alcohol becomes a must thing at the end of each day, where they don't realize, but the alcohol or whatever drug of choice becomes something that they depend on. They say, I can stop, but it's difficult to stop because the alcohol that was something random now has an emotional function. It's fulfilling something. It's helping with something, right? And so there are different levels. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Different levels of addiction, different levels in which those drugs, they end up taking a role in our lives and fulfilling some gaps, or at least giving us the illusion that that is what is happening. But there's more to it, right? So you may say, I don't drink at all, I don't smoke at all, but science today is looking also into what they call behavioral dependencies. And so you may not do that, but you may shop every time you feel sad, right? You may not do that, but you may deal with your anxieties and your frustrations and your difficulties by eating compulsively. Or you may just be someone who's totally addicted into social network. And science today shows, also with the study and the use of tomography, that when you are gambling, for example, right? So gaming, when you are gambling, the same circuitry that I was talking about is also activated. Science also shows that every time you connect to Facebook, for instance, there is a small release of dopamine into your brain. So we are seeing that it's not only the chemical drugs that are getting us addicted, but there's also a whole bunch of behaviors that are tapping into this reward circuitry and is keeping us from going into the deep waters in a sober way. So our opening was, for the ones who weren't here, a chapter by Emmanuel that talk about the need to go into deep waters. Go into deep waters is go deep into ourselves to have a very productive fishing, a very productive outcome, right? But in order to do that, we need to be sober. We need to be fully present. We cannot be distracted by all those things that we are talking about. Okay, so science concludes that the causes for all of these are in our genes. So they have done research where they look at identical twins with fraternal twins, and they realize that, you know, there's a much higher rate of addiction between identical twins. And also they look at the issue of availability. So there are few alcoholics in dry countries as well. There are few shopping addicts in impoverished communities where there's no Aventura Mall to go, right? Mm-hmm. Or financial power to be shopping at Banana Republic and Gap or things like that. So this is the conclusion. So they say the cause of addiction, much like the individual it affects, are complexly unique. But from behavioral fixations to chemical compulsions, answers may lie in our brains, our genes, and the greater world around us. So that's the materialistic perspective. So for us, we add another component to it. So going back to Suzana Giangeli, she'll say that in the psychogenesis of drug addiction, there is a bewildered spirit, insecure, sometimes rebellious, that brings with it from the past a heavy load of frustrations and defiance. So Joanna is looking at a spirit who is bewildered, right? Who is experienced a lot of struggles and disconnection. So that can be, and the opening reading also said that can be any of us. right? We all have moments in our lives that we feel this way. The life seems to be a little overwhelming, a little too much. But she also brings other important words: rebelliousness, defiance. So we're going to get to that in a little bit more. But a spirit who has a difficult time accepting life, accepting the challenges, and wants to take control over life, when in reality we don't have control of our lives, right? We have to some extent, but there's always a higher plan that is set for all of us, that comes from a higher source and a higher intelligence that knows better what's best for all of us. And I'm not going to read all of these, but she has 3 chapters in this book for anyone who is interested in going a little deeper into it. And one that talks about drugs, one that talks about tobacco, and one in alcoholism, chapters 12, 13, and 14. So on chapter 12, she highlights some of the causes for the use of drugs. And as we can see here, she's talking about feelings of fear, a spirit who is fearful, and but also who has this perspective of life being unfair, unjust. And also she mentions lack of tolerance for frustrations, difficulty in dealing with the frustrations of life. She talks about people for whom life should always be pleasant and rewarding. So some of us believe that, life should be always, like I was mentioning last month, an eternal vacation, right? When we say Happy New Year to each other, we usually are wishing to one another a year that is paradise-like. And this is not what life is about, right? So if that's your concept, if you're someone who is constantly on Facebook, you, for example, believing that all those thousands and thousands and thousands of people live a marvelous and wonderful life, but you don't. When in reality, many of those pictures they're put over there, sometimes the family is on vacation. People are fighting and killing each other, but in the midst of that chaos, they stop at a very beautiful beach and say, let's take a selfie. Boom, take a selfie, post on Facebook, and everybody's like, oh, how wonderful, they're having a great time. And that's not true. It's just not true. But then some of us believe that that's what life is truly about, and it's not. It's not, right? So, but some people in an unconscious way still wishes for that. So the chemical drug, people looking for an escape from reality that, due to its distressing rules and regulations, must be denied or extinguished at any price. That reality, that tough reality. So what drugs do is they help us to escape that reality for a moment. And she continues on by talking about tobacco and how the first cause of smoke is subjective in nature because it is intrinsic in the emotional makeup of the individual. And she talks about shyness, she talks about fear, self-esteem, anxiety, all feelings that lead people to lit that first cigarette. A lot of times, Patricia was talking about loneliness. The moment that someone's lit the cigarette, people, and usually they feel that they have power. They feel, if you're lonely, that you lit your cigarette, now you're no longer lonely. You're accompanied by that drug, right? Same thing when you perhaps alone in your home and you pick up that glass of wine or that whiskey, and now you feel like you're accompanied, and you see that we truly are accompanied by the spirits who join us in our practices. But we'll get to that. And then in alcoholism, here she talks about anxiety playing a preponderant part in the use of alcohol. If I had to summarize this, what do we get out of all these causes? We're talking about emotions. And the conclusion is that drug addiction is a symptom. We don't treat drug addiction by tackling the symptom. we need to understand that any type of addiction, any type of dependence, it speaks about a spirit who is emotionally in distress and who needs help at the spiritual and emotional level. So addiction is a symptom. It's not a cause to be treated. The causes are much deeper. And the primary cause, if you could put this way on a spiritual perspective, it is our disconnection from God, is our distancing from God. When we distance ourselves from God, we're distancing ourselves from the highest, most powerful and loving reference that we have in our lives. And if we lose this connection, if our Wi-Fi is so poor that we lose the connection, now we become our own reference. And we live our life through the lenses of ourselves as a reference. And we can think of that as if we would give a 5-year-old child and turn to this child and say, you no longer need me to guide you. You can be a reference for yourself. Or to a teenager and say, okay, you don't need me anymore as your parent. You can guide yourself. That's what happens spiritually to us, right? So now we're leading our lives disconnected from the only source that can truly guide us, and we are seeking happiness, which is the very beginning of our lecture, with our own references. So we seek to have, we seek to experience happiness quickly. We equal happiness to sensorial pleasures, which frankly there's nothing wrong with them. We are in a physical body. All the pleasures that material life grants us, they are there to be enjoyed. The thing is how we enjoy and with which end, for which purpose. How are we using this, and are we equating these sensorial moments of excitement to the happiness that we are seeking? So this disconnection brings outcomes. When a patient first starts to use toxic chemicals, and after the false euphoria and the fall into distress due to lack of artificial stimulus, quite often the person feels deeply uneasy and not well. So what happened here is you have that difficult moment, that distress feeling, and unable to go fishing in deep waters, right? You reach out for something that can either numb you or take you away from that feeling, from that uncomfortable place. And then the high produced by the drug fades away, and you find yourself again in the same hole, so to speak. And now you need to go back to it because that hole becomes unbearable. You go back to it. And gradually what also happens is that one glass of whatever you're drinking in the evening, now it's no longer satisfying you. So after, a period of time having a glass of whatever it is at the end of the day, now it's how about 2, right? And so you start now increasing the dosage. I mean, it gets to a point that maybe you're having a half bottle of vodka or you're having a full bottle of wine every single night. And what's happening here? What's happening here is not necessarily that the dosage is going up, but the emptiness is growing bigger. Because not only the drug will not fulfill you, but the emptiness will also increase little by little. And you find yourself each day in a deeper and deeper hole. And beyond that, we can add to the causes, to the emotional causes, what Spiritism will bring is also the perspective of our other incarnations. So Joanna will say in each one of those chapters, she'll speak about our past habits. Many hard addicts are victims of the same habit that they had in a previous existence. in which they dove into the deep abyss and came back with the marks of dependence that consumes them, carrying forward into the future serious issues that need to be atoned for. So, with the Spiritist perspective, there is all the troubles of the present moment, but a lot of times she's telling us the ones who become dependent and addicted to anything, they bring already this pattern, this behavior from past lives, which is ingrained in their psychic. Wounds that have not been attended, and habits, poor habits that have been built. And as we know, it's very difficult to change a habit because it is housed in the spirit and becomes also, it manifests itself in the physical organ, in the brain. So physically, we need to rewire our brain, which is possible, but it takes tremendous amount of work to fix something that has been wired, so to speak, in a wrong way, or in an unhealthy way, if you will. So she's going to continue and say, each less dignified habit acquired by the soul in the incessant course of the centuries function as a living entity in the universe of the feelings, compelling the individual to disturb regions and offering elements of connection with inferior spirits. So psychologically we know that the past, whether the past in this present life, our childhood experiences, or the past from our past lives, is not gone, does not disappear. It is within us, as she says, as a living entity. So although we may not be conscious, although we may not see it, it is playing a very significant role in our happiness and unhappiness and in each moment of our lives. So here she brings an important concept, another layer that Spiritism adds to it. We spoke about the emotional, we spoke about the past, and now we're going to add another component, and the component is the influence of the spirits. So for someone who is brand new, never heard about it, so we're here, right, and we are all spirits, some of us in the flesh, some of us outside. The laws that regulate our relationships are the same, whether we are in the flesh or outside of the flesh. What do I mean by that? We gather together, we influence one another. I'm right here speaking to you. Hopefully you came here for a reason. We are here for more or less the same reason. So this affinity brings us together. I'm speaking, I'm influencing you. You're listening. So the spirits will do the same thing because they are no different than us. So the laws are the same. And to better understand how the influence happens in the spiritual world, I brought you this very brief passage, because for someone who is brand new to Spiritism, this might sound like super crazy, but I think this passage normalizes and explains to us how the spiritual influences, they play a role in our lives. So it's a book by Andrew Lewis, who is a spirit. He's narrating what he's seen in the spiritual realm. They're in a house with a family, a widow, 3 children, an elderly couple around a dinner table. And then he observed something. There were 6 spirits enveloped in shadow, joined them at the meal. The spirits are together with them, as if they were taking nourishment by absorption. And Andrew Lewis is very distressed and curious about this phenomenon. And the mentor is going to say, are you so surprised at seeing them taking in food only by inhaling it? What about us? Are you perchance unaware of the fact that incarnate humans receive more than 70% of their normal nourishment through atmospheric elements collected by means of the respiratory channels? You know that substances cooked by fire undergo profound disintegration. Hence all the focus that yoga and so many other disciplines have on breathing, and capitalize on breathing, because we are indeed inhaling substances that can help with our nourishment. Well, our friends who are addicted to physiological sensations find in such disintegrated elements the same flavors they used to experience when in the flesh. So this is the explanation on how. So here we're talking about food, but we can be talking about alcohol. We can be talking about cigarette. Okay, we can be talking about any other thing. So the spirits will join us. If they have had a life where they were very, very deeply addicted, when we pass away, we don't change miraculously. Whatever our mind is, our mind will continue to be. Whatever our beliefs were, they will continue to be. Whatever our needs were, they will continue to be. And that's why, in order to prepare to die, we need to live each day seeking to detach from anything that is material, utilizing the material world to nourish the things that are the only ones that we will take with us, which is our feelings and our learnings and our experiences. So I brought one case, and there are so many cases in the works of Andrew Lewis, but this particular one is very interesting because this guy, Claudio Nogueira, he is in his home, and two spirits approach him, and they start telling him, drink, drink. They start to suggest, just like we suggest to each other, let's go for a drink. Wow, why don't you want to drink? Let's go, right? So a suggestion, they are suggesting. Now, he could not hear a sound. He was reading. Nevertheless, even if his physical eardrums had not registered the order, his mental waveband was attuned to the intruder. So, if you want to learn more about this, how all these things happen, we have courses here that can go deeper into it. But in a nutshell, we attune to one another in wavelengths, in vibration, right? So if you enter a place that is very, very low vibration and you're not in that vibration, you feel uneasy. But if that's what you're used to, you fit right in. So this is what this is talking about. So he wasn't hearing, but he was attuned to that vibration. The inappropriate guest repeated the order several times, like a hypnotist who wants an order obeyed. The result was not long in coming. The man stopped reading the political editorial that had engrossed him so much. He could not explain his sudden lack of interest, and he accepted the suggestion, convinced that he felt like having a shot of whiskey solely for himself. Okay, so what did I highlight here? He accepted the suggestion, because a lot of people freak out with those things and they say, so are we under the influence of the spirits? There's nothing that I can do. No, you can do everything. You cannot accept the suggestion. Okay, and so, but he accepted the suggestion, so actively accepted the suggestion. He wanted to calm down. Why did I put calm down in bold? The feeling, right? Where he was emotionally in need of calming down. So instead of praying, meditating, listening to some music, whatever, we have options. He decided to have a drink. The uninvited guest perceived that his victim had given into the suggestion and latched on to him. A light touch at first, an enveloped embrace, followed by a full embrace and reciprocal association. Now they are mentally associated. Both of them were integrated with each other in a perfect, extraordinary example of fluidic grafting. Claudio the man was absorbing the discarnate like a shoe adjusting to a foot. They melded with each other as if they were going to inhabit one body. They stood up at the same time and turned around in the small place, totally integrated, and pick up the bottle. The first gulp rolled down the throat, both simultaneously smacked their lips in pleasure. So they both enjoying the physical sensation. Okay? Now, when I did this lecture on Tuesday, people were like, this is freaky. Right? So, again, I'm not here to tell you what you need to do or should do. And I honestly don't think that this is about making anyone feel bad. I think it's about each one of us doing our homework and checking with our unconscious, what are we doing, but most important, why are we doing? So it's not, I'm not here saying don't have fun, don't have pleasure. It's not that, but it is, You with yourself. Pay attention to what you're doing and why you're doing. So another important aspect is Andrew Lewis was curious about how much of an influence that spirit had on that man, on Claudio. Was he like so obsessed, like we like to say, that he could no longer reason? Was the influence so deep that there was nothing that he could do, like power-wise to block that influence? And as he observes, he realizes that I could see right away that he remained free inwardly. He was not experiencing any kind of torment as he yielded. He merely hosted the discarnate and willingly accepted his guidance. There was no symbiosis in which he was the victim. There was only implicit association and natural mixing. The experience was based on percussion, appeal and response, all strings absolutely in tune. The discarnate suggested, the incarnate agreed. The former requested, the latter conceded. In other words, you can say, oh, this is obsession. No, simply suggested. Simply suggested, right? And again, nothing extraordinary to this. It happens every day in our lives among incarnates. I suggest, I send the idea to you, you embrace that idea, we associate, and we become partners in what we are doing. He was free. He was not in a position where his mind could not function or he could not reason. He was free. So this is Sex and Destiny. It is available in English as well. So, complex, right? But when I start thinking about the healing path, I was like, okay, we started talking about happiness and the brain. So let's look for healing through the brain as well. And Andrew Lewis, In a Greater World is the book. The spirit Calderado, who is the mentor in this book, he compares the brain to a house that has 3 levels. And on the basement, he compares the basement to the subcortical areas, your brainstem, your cerebellum, areas that are responsible for automatic movements or automaticity. So for example, breathing. Your breathing is controlled by this area of the brain. You don't think, oh, I gotta start breathing, I gotta stop breathing, I gotta breathe faster. It just happens that way. So it's an automatic regulation. That is done by the basement of your brain. And also in this area, our past is stored. All our accomplishments, but also all our tendencies and all our habits, everything that we have built in the course of our lives is stored over there. So in the consciousness is the things that we are learning at the present moment. We cannot keep everything in the consciousness because we need to open space in our brain for new experiences. So when things are learned and become a habit or a tendency, they store in places where automaticism takes place. And so we have in this area of the brain our past. Okay, we can also call the unconscious. It's right there. It's on the basement. On the first floor is the cortex. Is our ego. Is the persona. Is the present moment. On this floor, effort and will live. They live in this floor. Residing down here are automatic impulses. Residing on the first floor, this couple, Miss Effort and Mr. Will. And so they are operating in the present moment and they are taking charge of our current acquisition. So everything that we are learning in the present moment, everything that we are building happens in this area of our brain. And then we have the second floor. The second floor is the prefrontal cortex. Actually, scientists are very puzzled by our prefrontal cortex, because they realize that we use a tiny fraction of our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is, according to Andrew Lewis, the superconscious, where our ideas, higher goals, and the future is being built. It's the area where we are nourishing and we are building our superior concepts. Okay? So this is how the brain is divided. So he has a description of a downfall of a spirit in this book that is very interesting, and I'll share with you. We're examining two sick beings here, one in the flesh and the other outside it. The brains of both are compromised and completely attuned to each other. Spiritually, they both have rolled down from the third floor, so they disconnected from God, they disconnected from the superior meanings of life, and yielded to their unrestrained will. They missed the chance to take shelter on the second floor. Okay, so they didn't have the discipline and the ability to use the will in their favor, so they could not stop on the second floor either, and have lost a valuable chance to pick themselves up again. Thus they have fallen into the sphere of instinctive impulses, where all previous animalistic experiences are recorded. So a definition of how someone rose down from the top, does not make to the first floor, and end up on the bottom, right? How do we fix it? So 3 ideas in wrapping up. Jesus says, reconcile quickly with your adversary. Who is the adversary? It's not that person out there. Our adversary is within us. It's the parts of us that we dislike, that we don't care for, that we judge. So it is our limitations, it is our own darkness, that in order to treat, right, we have to go into deep waters. We have to dive right here into the basement of our homes. We have to understand that we are not evil, we're frail. We have to understand that darkness comes from a wounded place. And so reconcile with your adversaries, reconcile with yourself, forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for being simply a human being. So the first part of healing, right, when we're talking about drugs and addiction, is the ability to love yourself where you are. Embracing and watching our tendencies and understanding that behind and underneath our behaviors, there are feelings that need to be not judged, but need to be cared for. So reconciliation. At the present moment, repeat with Paul, all things are lawful to me, but not all things are beneficial. We understand with the Spiritism that there are so many things that we want to do, but we can choose better. So tapping into our effort, tapping into our will, you can say to yourself, I haven't been able to heal myself entirely. I feel the urge to do this and that. I understand that's no longer in my best interest. So I'm going to refrain from doing that. And I'm going to start loving myself and giving myself only the very best. And then finally, we need to reconnect. If the primary source of our disease is disconnection from God, we need to reach out to it and say, I can do everything through Him who strengthens me. Through Jesus, who is the representation of God, the highest one we have here with ourselves, or with God, which is the source of all power and all strength. So, obviously, this is a very simplistic representation. But when we think about healing ourselves and being able to live more consciously, more present, these are the levels, these are the steps that we need to address. It's not enough to just be here on the present and say, oh, it's a matter of will. Come on. Your will is weak, right? just discipline, discipline, discipline. It doesn't work by itself. You need to go down to the basement and figure out what is there, and you need also to reach out to the only one who can truly help us. So the brain and the being needs to be addressed at all levels. And this is the only source that is not in English. Everything else is available in English. Joana de Angelis will conclude for us. At this time of disorders of varying denomination, the therapy of the gospel is the most valuable, without any demerit for the others, for providing inner joy, hope of fulfillment, and guideline for self-enlightenment. So this is what we have to offer, the therapy of the gospel. For this world in deep search for happiness, for contentment, and for harmony, there is no doubt that the gospel is the most valuable path for providing the inner joy that we're looking for, hope for fulfillment, to fulfill the emptiness, to truly, truly fulfill that gap, that hole that we were talking about, and to guide us to self-enlightenment. So with that, we close our presentation and